Hello guys. So in this video, we're going to talk about how to do velocity problems, average velocity problems specifically. And we are basically going to have a function of s of t, which is right here. And basically what we're going to do is we are going to use this formula for average velocity. Notice how I have the bar over the v, which signifies average. And we're basically just gonna simplify this. So notice how this is this similar formula to average rate of change. That's because average velocity is a rate of change. So average velocity would also be considered an average rate of change. So without further ado, the first thing we do is we identify what our T1 and T2 are. So in this case, we're going to identify T1 and T2. This is the problem. So as we can see right here, our T1 and T2 is the interval over which velocity is acting. So in this case, it is from 0 to 1. So our T1 is 0 and our T2 is equal to 1. The next step would be to identify S of T2 or S of T1 and S of T2. So we can do this by simply just plugging in T1 into the equation and T2 into the equation. So we're going to go ahead and do that actually. So S of T1 is equal to S of, what's our T1? Our T1 is 0, so S of 0. And then everywhere we see T, plug in 0. So 5, 0 raised to the 4th power. And I'm getting S of T from this function right here. Minus 6, 0 raised to the 3rd power. Plus 8 of 0 raised to the 2nd power. Minus 0 plus 10. And for the second function, S of T2, we apply the exact same logic, except our T2 is equal to 1. So we plug in 1. So this would be 5, 1 to the 4th power minus 6, 1 to the 3rd power plus 8, 1 to the 2nd power minus 1 from this T plus 10. So when we complete this arithmetic, all these zeros, all these terms of S of 0 will zero out. So 0, 0, 0, 0. But so we're left with this 10. So S of T1, after we plug in T of 1, is just equal to 10. And S of 1, when we do arithmetic, 5, 1 raised to the 4th power is 5. 5 minus 6 is negative 1. So I'm going to go ahead and write that down here. So it's 5 minus 6 plus 8 minus 1 plus 10. And this would be equal to 15, 23, 23 minus 7, which would be equal to 16. So our S of 2 is equal to 16. So now the final step to find the average velocity would literally just be to plug it into the formula. So average velocity is equal to S of T2 minus S of T1 over T2 minus T1. And this is equal to S of T2, we identified it to be 16, minus S of T1, we identified S of T1 to be equal to 10, divided by T2 minus T1. So 1 minus 0, so this is equal to 6. and that is our average velocity. So the idea is, step one, identify your variables of t, identify your function s of t. Step two is identify s of t and s of t1 and s of t2 by plugging in your t terms. Step three is plug it into the average velocity formula, which is this one right here. And then you just plug and chug and then you solve. And that's how you do it. Nothing more complicated than that. So, all right, thank you guys. I hope this was helpful for y'all. So in this example, we are asked to find the average velocity because we have the bar over the v, so that means average. Anytime in math or physics you see a bar over a number, it's telling you to find the average. So velocity is essentially a rate of change. So that's why this formula is very similar to the average rate of change formula, which I do have a video on that in this calculus playlist. So the idea is that we are given an interval of t1 from t1 to t2, and we are given a function s of t, and we want to find the average velocity of this function. So how do we do that? Well, it's a real simple step-by-step procedure that we follow. So the first thing we do is we are going to identify t1 and t2. So how do we do that? We look at these intervals and we see our t1 of t2. t1 is equal to 0 and t2 is equal to 3. So now the next step would be to identify s of t2 and s of t1. So the next step is to identify s of t1 and s of t2. So how do we do that? We simply do that by just plugging in the t boundaries. So our s of t1 would be equal to s of, what is our t boundary? It's 0. So we plug in 0. So everywhere we see a t, we're going to just substitute in 0. And for s of t2, we do the same thing, except instead of plugging in 0, we're plugging in our t2 term, which in this case, it's 3. So everywhere we see t for s of 2, we plug in 3. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. So 5 t to the third, so 0 to the third, minus 6 0 squared, plus 8t, so 8 raised to the 0, minus 1. And for the lower problem, we're going to plug in 3. So 5 of 3 raised to the third power minus 6, 3 raised to the second power, plus 8 times 3, 8 times t, minus 1. And now we just simply apply arithmetic. So this arithmetic is simple because there's 3 0 terms that zero out, so we're left with negative 1. So that's our t. Our s of t of 1 is equal to negative 1. And our s of t of 2, we apply arithmetic. So 3 raised to the third power is 27 times 5. 27 times 5 would be equal to, let's see real quick, 135. 3 raised to the second power is 9 times 6 is equal to 54, plus 8 times 3, 24, minus 1. So this arithmetic comes out to be minus 30, minus 31. This arithmetic comes out to be 104. So this is our s of 2. S of 2 is equal to 104. So now the final step is to literally just plug it into the formula. So plug into the average rate, the average velocity change formula. So the formula is S of T2 minus S of T1 over T2 minus T1. And all we simply do now is just plug and chug. So 104 minus our T1, our S of T1, which was -1, over 3 minus 0. So the final answer is 105 divided by 3. And you can simplify this because we can divide 105 divided by 3. So our average velocity comes out to be 105 divided by 3, which would be 35. That is our average velocity. So it's really just a couple steps you follow. So step 1, identify your T1 and T2 and identify your function S of T. Step 2, plug in T1 and T2 so that way you can get S of T1 and S of T2, which we got to be -1 and 104. Step 3, we plug it into the average rate of the average velocity change formula, which is this one right here, as I also have it up here. And after we plug it in and do all the arithmetic, we came out with 35 as our final answer. So I hope this was helpful. If you saw any value in this, y'all know what to do. Thank you.